Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So I'm going to talk about the first and second councils, and we'll begin the story at the time of the Buddha's parinibbana. That's what we refer to the passing of a Buddha, what for an ordinary person we would call his death. For a Buddha we say parinibbana, and he entered parinibbana at Kusinara, and at that time there were many signs and wonders, one of which was that the Devas of Tawatingsa showered the site with blossoms from the Parichataka tree. And these were very beautiful large flowers that are not found anywhere on earth. So a few days later, Mahakassapa, one of the Buddha's great disciples, was walking on the road with a large company of bhikkhus when they saw a naked ascetic coming the other way carrying one of these blossoms. And Mahakassapa recognized this was not a flower of the earth and that it came from Tawatingsa heaven. And he asked the ascetic, "Where did you get this flower?" And the ascetic told them about the Buddha's parinibbana. And immediately upon hearing this, all those bhikkhus in the company who were not yet fully awakened became distraught and cried aloud and wept and in grief. And all those bhikkhus who were already arahants, they merely nodded their heads and said, "So it is, so it is." So the master always said, that which is born is subject to death. But there was one bhikkhu named Subhadda who said, "Don't be upset. We're well rid of this great samana always telling us what we can do and what we can't do. Now we can do whatever we like." So immediately there was trouble in the Sangha. Mahakassapa knew this had to be brought under control right away, and he decided then and there they needed to hold a council of the bhikkhus after the master's death to formulate the Dhamma and the Vinaya and agree on the teachings. The backstory of this Subhadda is that when he was a young monk, one of his relatives wanted to make a meal offering to the Buddha and the Sangha. And while they were preparing it, Subhadda went around bossing the people in the kitchen and ordering things, do this, do that, which a monk is not supposed to do. He's not supposed to be organizing a meal offering. And then the Buddha refused to accept the offering, and this offended and upset Subhadda, and he always had a grudge against the Buddha. So I think we've all met people like this. In any case, this was the first sign of trouble after the passing of the Buddha. And Kassapa took it upon himself to organize the meeting of the bhikkhus. And the idea was that they would gather together 500 arahant bhikkhus at Rajagaha and hold an assembly over the rains retreat. And they would put the word out, no other bhikkhus other than those 500 were to be allowed to spend the rains at Rajagaha. And the reason for this is simple. It's because the council was considered a sangha kama, an act of the sangha. And according to the Vinaya rules for the performance of a sangha kama, all the monks in residence at that place must attend. And if there's anyone in that place, any bhikkhu in that place who's not attending, then it invalidates the Sangha. So to keep things proper and under control, they decided 500 arahants and nobody else. But there was a problem right away because the Buddha's attendant, Ananda, who had a flawless memory, had the best recollection of all the teachings of the Buddha, but he was not yet an arahant. So they invited him anyway, and they spent the first month preparing the grounds and the facilities for this great assembly. And Ananda spent the month in meditation to try and finish the task. And it's said that at the very last day before the council was to begin, Ananda was going to spend the whole night in walking meditation to try and finish his practice. And at the end, with a sense of giving up, he went to lie down on his mat, and from the sitting posture to the lying posture, he went through the 3 stages of awakening, became a once-returner, a non-returner, and an arahant. And this story, this detail is often used in as a teaching parable in teaching meditation, because he was able to liberate his mind when he gave up this goal-oriented attitude. He was striving, but he was striving with a mind with an agenda. And then it was only when he gave that up. And the other point is that he attained these states neither sitting, nor walking, nor standing, nor lying, but while changing postures. I've heard traditional Burmese Vipassana teachers use this as to emphasize the importance of being mindful while changing postures. Pay attention when you're sitting down or standing up, because Ananda attained 3 stages of awakening while changing postures. So Ananda attended the council as an arahant, and the commentary adds colorful detail or a miraculous detail to the account to leave no doubt that he had attained arahantship. First, he entered the hall levitating. He floated into the hall, into his seat. And then a dewa from the Sudawasa, the pure lands, the pure abodes where anagamis go, manifested in front of the assembly and declared, Ananda has laid down the burden, Ananda has finished the path. So there were 2 monks who were essential in this assembly. The other one, besides Ananda, was Upali. And Upali was the master of Vinaya. And he was the one who best remembered and had studied all the Buddha's pronouncements on Vinaya. So he rehearsed, as they say, rehearsed the Vinaya. And they went through the rules of the Patimokkha one by one, and he was questioned, what are the first class of rules? They are the parajika, the rules of expulsion. And what is the first parajika? That's the parajika of having intercourse, sexual intercourse. And when did the Blessed One lay down this rule? And then he tells the story. So they rehearsed right through the entire Vinaya. And then it was Ananda's turn to go through the entire Sutta Pitaka. And it said that the whole assembly took 7 months. And most of the suttas in the Sutta Pitaka, they begin with the phrase, Ewang me sutang, thus have I heard. Because the wording is exactly as spoken by Ananda at the first council. He began by saying, "Thus have I heard." At that time, the Blessed One was in VIII and so on and so forth. So this was the Abhidhamma Pitaka was not rehearsed at the first council. That came later. But the two Pitakas, the Vinaya and Sutta, were considered to be fixed and determined at this time, immediately after the Buddha's death. There was also some other business transacted by this council. The first and most important was that it was brought up that the Buddha had declared to Ananda, "After my passing, Ananda, the bhikkhus may, if they wish, dispense with the lesser and minor rules." So then Ananda was asked, "Did you ask the Blessed One which were the lesser and minor rules?" And Ananda had to admit he neglected to ask for a clarification. And the assembly debated for some time what they should call the lesser and minor rules, and they couldn't come to a consensus. So it was agreed in the end, we'll keep the rules exactly as they are. We won't dismiss any of them. Because if they were to arbitrarily dismiss some Vinaya rules at that point, the fear was that lay people would say, "Oh, these monks are getting lax. As soon as the master's gone, they loosen up the discipline." So the decision was made there and then to keep the Vinaya. And the Vinaya is considered to be fixed, that there is no body within Theravada Buddhism that has the authority to change the Vinaya. The Vinaya remains as laid down by the Buddha until the coming of the next Buddha. There's no power on earth that can alter or amend the Vinaya rules. There was also what's sometimes called the trial of Ananda. He was criticized on several points and he defended himself. The first one was this, that he had neglected to ask the Buddha what was the minor and lesser rules, and he admitted the fault that it did not occur to him to ask. There were 5 of these points altogether. The second one was that he had disrespected, according to some, the accusation was he had disrespected the Buddha by putting his foot on the Buddha's robe. And it turns out he was repairing the robe, sewing it, and he had no one to help him, so he stretched out the cloth by holding it with his foot. And he said, "I meant no disrespect by this act, but I will confess my fault is seen as such." The third offense was that after the Buddha died, he let the women pay respects to the body first before the bhikkhus, which was a breach of etiquette. And one of the points raised was that the women defiled the Buddha's body with their tears. So it seems harsh, but this was also raised in the assembly, and Ananda said he saw no fault in it. He wanted to let them have their chance because he didn't see they would get a chance later, and he didn't think it was a fault, but he will confess it. The fourth one was that he neglected to ask the Buddha to remain alive for a kappa. Now, this is a very controversial episode. Shortly before the Buddha's parinibbana, he had said to Ananda that the Tathagata may, if he wishes, remain in existence for a full kappa. And Mara invaded Ananda's mind and confused him with visions. So he didn't think, he was befuddled, and he didn't think to ask, to beseech the Buddha to remain. Now the controversy surrounds what is the meaning of a kappa in this case. The ordinary meaning of a kappa would mean the age of a world system. Like in this case, it would mean that the Buddha could remain in existence until the end of the world. But that seems actually unlikely. It would seem to violate many broader principles of Dhamma, that would undermine the view of impermanence. And it would mean that when the next Buddha come, there would be two Buddhas in existence at once, which is also said to be impossible. So how it's generally interpreted, as the commentary interprets it, is that by a kappa he meant a full human lifespan, which was thought to be 100 years. So it's probable what the Buddha was saying, he could have lived another 20 years. But in any case, Ananda did not ask him to, so he didn't do it. And the fifth point that they raised was that at the time of the establishment of the Bhikkhuni order, the order of nuns, it was Ananda's intervention that persuaded the Buddha to establish that order. And the prediction was that if the order of nuns was established, then the teaching of the Buddha would only survive 500 years. If it was not established, it would survive 1,000 years. This is also a controversial passage, and there has been some scholarship that indicates that it may have been a later imposition, a later interpolation into the text. The language used in that passage, it's in the, I believe it's in the Chulawaga, it's in one of the Vinaya books. The language used is that if the order of nuns is established, the Sadhamma will last only 500 years. Sadhamma means good Dhamma or right teaching. And this is a word or a phrase that's extremely rare or non-existent elsewhere in the canon. But where it does show up is in later literature, after the Mahayana had begun, and there were controversies between the Theravada and the Mahayana. The Mahayana criticized the older schools as Hinayana. The Theravada and the other traditional schools called themselves the Sadhamma, and the Mahayana was the Miccha Dhamma, or the wrong Dhamma. So it was, and also the time frame of 500 years is suspicious, because that would be about the time Mahayana began. In any case, it's an oddity, and certainly the Buddha's teaching has survived much longer than 500 years. So this little passage is called the Trial of Ananda. And finally, when the council wrapped up, we have another sign of trouble to come, in that a bhikkhu named Parana arrived with a large company of his followers after the council was finished and other bhikkhus were allowed into Rajagaha. He arrived and they told him what they had done. And he said, "That's good, that's well done. May it be so, but as for me and my followers, we will remember the teaching as we heard it." So already there were some bhikkhus who were not accepting the canon as established at the first council. But in general, the canon as fixed by the first council has remained fixed, and all the subsequent schools of Buddhism look back to the first council as the establishment of the canon. Then we move on 100 years later, and in the 100 years, the Buddhist teaching had spread widely in India and was spreading out beyond the bounds of the middle country. The middle country, or the Majjhima Padesa, is the Ganges Valley. This is the core of the Buddhist heartland. But the teaching was now spreading to the east and west and south across India. And in those days, of course, there was not easy transportation or communication between distant places. So there was a natural tendency for the different groups of bhikkhus to begin drifting apart in their practice. And a crisis moment arrived about 100 years after the Buddha in Vesali, when there was a group of monks at Vesali that had come to practice a modified Vinaya. They had loosened up or modified several of the rules. And a visiting monk from elsewhere named Yasa, who was more traditionally minded, he went to stay at one of their monasteries. And after the puja and the Dhamma talk, he was shocked to see that the monks put out a brass bowl and the lay people put coins in the bowl. And then the monks, after the lay people left, the monks divided up the coins amongst themselves. So he said, "Sir, don't you know it's against the Vinaya for monks to have coined money, to accept gold and silver?" And they said, "Oh, we have an allowance for receiving money." And it turns out they had these 10 allowances that they'd made up. And these were the points of controversy, the 10 allowances. And they were, number one, what's called the salt horn allowance. The monks are not, by the Vinaya, they're not allowed to store food, keep food from day to day, but they would keep salt in a horn to flavor their food, and made an allowance for that. The second one they called the 2 finger breadths allowance. The rule for the monks eating is that they have to finish eating before noon. And you have to remember this was a time before mechanical clocks. So noon was defined as when the shadow of the sun passed the midpoint. And a simple way of doing it is to put a stick in the ground and see when the shadow moves from the west to the east of the stick. But these monks were saying that they could continue eating until the shadow had gone 2 finger breadths beyond the midpoint. The third point was called among the villages. It said if after the meal, if the monks were still hungry, they could go out and beg for more food in the village, which is also a violation of the Vinaya. The fourth was called the residences, and this referred to a Sangakama. When a Sangakama, such as the reciting of the Patimokkha, happens, it's invalidated if all the monks in a monastery are not present. And this allowance said that there could be separate Sangakamas for different groups of monks within a monastery. They didn't have to all be united. The fifth rule is kind of similar. It said that if any monk did not attend the Sangakama, he could simply be told about it afterwards. It's actually very important in the Vinaya that when the Sangakama occurs, that every monk be present. There was a way in which probably still happens in really large monasteries where it's hard to keep count of is everybody here. They would have a specially marked stick, like a decorative thing made out of ivory or wood. And there would be a pegboard at the hall, and when you came in, you put your stick in the hole in the pegboard, and they could see if it was filled, if all the monks were attending. And they also had a 6-point that they would, rather than follow the Vinaya as laid down by the Buddha, they would allow their own customs to take precedent. And they allowed unchurned buttermilk as an additional allowable in the afternoon. They allowed the drinking of unfermented toddy. So I take this to be something like a mildly alcoholic beer or wine. Toddy was a fermented alcoholic drink. So they would allow the monks to have that as a drink if it wasn't fully fermented. They allowed a sitting cloth without a border. And the 10th point was they allowed the monks to receive gold and silver. So this is really the one of the 10 that's the most important and that precipitated the crisis. So first, this visiting monk Yasa accused them of breaking the Vinaya, and there was a back and forth. They suspended him, and then he criticized them publicly, and it stayed for a while within the controversy within VIII, and the lay people were taking the side of this other monk Yasa. So the bhikkhus of Vasily drove him away. And then there followed a period when both factions were traveling around India seeking adherents. They were going to have a big council and settle the matter of the Vinaya. And there was a lot of politicking, back and forth, getting support, bringing groups of monks together. And they assembled a very large council, and it was not able to come to any agreement for a long time. There was a lot of bitter back and forth, and it was decided by the larger group, in the interest of harmony, will appoint like a jury, a council of 4 monks from each side to come to a decision, and we'll all accept the decision that they make. We can't decide in a large group. And these 8 monks took some time to debate, and they ended up favoring the position of Yasa to stay with the original Vinaya and not allow these 10 allowances. And the other monks who were actually in the majority, the larger group, wanted the laxer interpretation, but they accepted it begrudgingly. But this didn't make an end of the problem. The council, in the long run, was a failure. It succeeded in the short term in getting an agreement to keep the Vinaya intact, but it failed in the larger project of getting all the monks together in harmony, because there was, from then on, there was a division in the Sangha, and it became formalized 37 years later, when there was a special council at Pataliputra, and this was the first official schism or separation of the Sangha occurred at this council. And this was, although it had its roots in the Vinaya controversy of the Second Council, it was called on points of Dhamma. There was a character called Mahadeva who propounded 5 points that had the consequence of reducing the status of an arahant. And there are some different versions of this. This whole episode is rather murky in the sources. There are different versions, which one would expect from such a controversial moment. The 5 points can be found not under this name, but they're in the Katawatu, in the very first chapter of the Katawatu, the Book of Debates. the first debates they bring up all revolve around these 5 points. The first point is sometimes stated as an arahant can do wrong or can commit bad karma, which goes against the traditional teaching. But the way it's expressed in the Katawatu and in some other sources is more specific. It says that an arahant can have a emission of semen, which again would be impossible for one without lust. In the Katawatu, part of the debate says, well, where if one of the heretics who's saying that an arahant can have an emission says, well, where does the semen come from if the arahant doesn't have lust? And he says, Mara brings it. The second point of Mahadeva was that an arahant may not even know that he is an arahant. The third point is that an arahant may have doubts about the doctrine. So it's the traditional view. The arahant has a completely purified view, and he would not have any doubts or uncertainties about things like the Four Noble Truths and the dependent origination, the three characteristics, and so on. These are fully penetrated by his mind. But he's not considered to be omniscient, and the example is given that he may not know the name of a man or a woman. He may not know the shortest route to a town, or these sort of mundane worldly matters. Doesn't know all these sorts of things. And the argument given in the Katawatu by the other side is that because he doesn't know these things, he may be confused about more important things. The fourth point is also stated in various places in different ways. It's sometimes phrased as he needs a teacher, or he's subject to teaching. And the way it's stated in the Katawatu is perhaps more direct and to the point. It says that an arahant can fall away, meaning he can stop being an arahant. He can be an arahant and then lose it. And the fifth one is odd. It said that, and again, it's hard to pin down what it actually originally meant, but it said that in one version that the attainment of arahantship is accompanied by a verbal exclamation. And the debate in the Katawatu revolves around whether one in jhana can speak. So these are the 5 points of Mahadeva, and we don't need to get bogged down in the details, but the point was to reduce the status of the arahant as a perfected being. Now, this Mahadeva is a very curious character and difficult to pin down. There are a number of slightly varying accounts that survive only in Tibetan or Chinese translations. He doesn't seem to occur at all in the Pali sources. And the sources that we do have make him out to be a very wicked person. And his biography usually includes, before he became a monk, many horrendous deeds, beginning with having sexual relations with his mother, then killing his father, then later killing his mother as well, and killing some other people, including a arahant bhikkhu. So this would have meant, if these stories are true, that would have meant that he committed 3 of the 5 heinous kamas, so he could not possibly attain enlightenment in this lifetime. So one can suspect that these stories may have been an attempt to later to really blacken his character. But the curious thing is that these stories are found in Mahayana sources, and he is in a way a precursor of Mahayana, because this Mahadeva and his 5 points, and the council that was called at Pataliputra, was considered to be the first split, the first formal split of the Sangha into schools. The majority of the council supported the 5 points, but a large faction refused to support them, and the two groups were unreconciled at the end of the council. The group that supported the 5 points were called the Mahasangikas, which means the large group. It's sort of like the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the big group or the majority. They called themselves that. We're the big group, the Mahasangha, Mahasangikas. And the other group called the Staviravadas. And Staviravada is a Sanskrit version of the same name as Theravada. It means the school of the elders. So the split was between the big group and the traditionalists, or we're not going with the new doctrine, we're staying put. That's the Viravada, the elders. In a short while, the Mahasamgikas began developing their doctrines further, and they came up with various proposals and ideas relating to the nature of a Buddha, amongst other things. They said that the material body, power, and longevity of the Buddha is without limit. The Buddha does not sleep or dream. The Buddha answers questions without thinking. And curiously, the Buddha never says a word because they are always in samadhi. But beings, thinking that they utter words, jump for joy. In a single moment of thought, Buddhas comprehend all Dhammas. Buddhas remain in all directions. There are Buddhas everywhere in the 4 directions. So we can see here in the Mahasamgikas there was a dual agenda going on to downgrade the status of the Arahant and to increase to the level of some kind of godlike figure, the status of a Buddha, to separate the gulf between an Arahant and a Buddha greatly increased. And these ideas of a Buddha being so utterly transcendent without any connection to the human form precedes the ideas in Mahayana. It's a precursor idea to what we see in Mahayana. And the Mahasangikas are considered to have eventually led to various other schools out of which the Mahayana emerged. And the Staviravada became also split into various groups, including the Theravada, which is now the only surviving original school from those days. But altogether there were traditionally considered to be 18 schools in short order that divided and split from this initial break between the Staviravadas and the Mahasamgikas. So to recapitulate the main points here, we began with the first council, which occurred immediately after the Buddha's death, in which the canon was fixed. We have a second council 100 years later that was called on points of Vinaya, and although it decided in favor of keeping the original Vinaya, there was a dissatisfied large number of monks who wanted the more lenient Vinaya, that eventually these other monks, the non-compliant monks, became followers of this Mahadeva and his 5 points, and at a council called 37 years later, established the Mahasamgikas as the first kind of breakaway division in the Buddhist sasana and the emergence of new doctrines.